What is up, and welcome to the Bet Chicago Sports podcast. I am Shane Jackson. I'm very excited for this one. I'm joined today by Tyler Shoemaker of Cleveland.com. He's pretty much everywhere. He does projections for college football and the NFL, does a lot of sports betting stuff with kind of math in mind, and I thought there was no better way to have him on and kind of explain his process and how that all came about, and just kind of get into the weeds of that a little bit. And less so about the actual games. You know, we have NFL Week 4 coming up, another college football slate coming up, and maybe we'll get to it at the end if we have time. But this will really be about like sports betting and anybody who's kind of new to the whole, the idea of projections and using that kind of stuff with their sports betting. So Tyler, thank you so much for joining me today. And just first off, let's kind of get into your background. I mean, explain a little bit about what you do in the sports betting space and how people can find all your work.
Yeah, well, first, Shane, I appreciate you having me on. So, like you said, I'm kind of everywhere right now. Been trying to up my podcast appearances and things like that, just to kind of help get the word out. Because all the information that I provide, I do for free. I don't sell any picks or anything like that. Everything I do is 100% free. Just trying to help people become smarter with sports betting. So I started recreationally sports betting in like 2017. And I'm just a really naturally competitive person. So when I first started, like, obviously it wasn't going so well. Just, I like this team, I'm going to throw a few bucks here. So I was like, man, how can I like really get good at this? So that was kind of the start of, okay, now I'm like handwriting, like pen and paper, like just some very basic math stuff just to try to get some sort of edge. And then over the years, that's obviously gotten more sophisticated, more complex. And now I've got, my Google sheet that I share some of my information on my Google sheet, and then I have my own like private master sheet with all the formulas and everything in it. But so it's definitely evolved over the years, and hopefully for the better.
Yeah, for sure. No, and it's really interesting. It's how I kind of discovered you as well. It's just like seeing that you had publicly made kind of numbers for both college football and the NFL, and that's a rarity, right? Like I do my own power ratings, but I don't make that publicly available because I don't want people to tease me about, hey, you have this team way too low or too high. Which is the whole point of like power rankings and all that stuff. It's just for people to complain about. But I really do like that. There's not a lot of people who have public ratings. And so I thought that was super interesting that you do that. And you can tell that you're constantly updating it every single week as well. Remember, this podcast is presented by Caesar Sportsbook, by the way. I didn't mention that at the top. If you're watching the video version of this podcast, very easy to sign up with Caesar Sportsbook. Just scan the QR code there in the lower right corner and take advantage of their new user offer by doing that. So let's get into your projections a little bit. You have them for both NFL and college football, and we were mentioning how it all started. At first it was just kind of you were sports betting by maybe guessing numbers and using a little bit of a math. But then when did you decide maybe to make this Excel sheet and get into the kind of the weeds of the projections and the models and stuff like that?
Yeah, I would say the first like early days of my spreadsheet with formulas and stuff, and it was probably 2019. And then, it's really hard because there's just so much information out there, just so many stats and so many different computer models and stuff because when you first start, that's kind of the first piece of advice I would give is like, when you're first starting to make your own numbers, look at other computer models or other models that you respect. Like SP Plus or something, for instance, like look at that. And, if you're 20 points off of what that is, like you're probably not doing something right with your formula. So, just give yourself kind of a safety net baseline, using those type of models and then kind of sharpen it from there.
Yeah. And I think even before you even get into all that, right, there's an initial way of doing this, especially on the NFL side, right? When the lines get first dropped on Sunday, maybe don't look at them right away. Come up with your own number, right? Guess what you think the spread's going to be and see how close you are to that. And that's, no math. That's just you, maybe your gut telling you, hey, what kind of number? Because that's basically all I did last football season. And before I actually try to get sophisticated with it with the ratings or whatever. But even that, I would recommend maybe viewers or listeners of the show to do that. I think that is very helpful because then you can explain like, hey, maybe why was I so far off from what I thought the number was going to be. And if there is an advantage from betting wise, take advantage of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how have they evolved? You said you just started in 2019. How has your system evolved in the last couple of years?
Yeah, I mean, just from a structural level, it's a lot less manual now. I've taught myself a lot about, VLOOKUPs and different formulas and stuff just to automate my process as much as possible. And what that's allowed me to do is really like take a step back and analyze the actual results as opposed to spending all of my time just putting in the data. So, now I'm scraping a lot of my data from different websites, and pulling that in automatically overnight, and then have formulas set up to take that data and then do with it what I want to do with it. So then a lot of my time now, like I said, is spent actually looking at the numbers and the past results and handicapping games as opposed to just manually doing the grunt work. So I think that's the biggest evolution of what I've done. And also I think just kind of honing in on some of the key stats that I want to look at. Cause like I said, when you first get into it, it's so overwhelming. You're like, well, should I look at their points per game, or should I look at their points per possession, or, passing yards per game? Like how do you take all of these stats that are widely available and make them into something predictive? And I think that's really hard. And that's something that I feel like I've gotten better at as I've started to kind of weed out stats that I'm not going to take into account.
Yeah. And I think that's a good point, right? Is trying to figure out what stats are important and what are not. To me, I think it's interesting that you do the football side of it, right? And you're using so much math within football because it's such a smaller sample size, right? Like the way I use projections, just like sports like basketball, where you have so many different games. You're like, okay, then we'll see how this works out by the end of the year. But it's like this is 12 college football games, and it's like, how much do you adjust maybe from one game to the next? And do you find that part of it challenging, just how much smaller sample size it is?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. With football and college football in particular, there's just so few data points each year that I think, and I saw there was a discussion going on Twitter with the college football nerds, and Bill Connolly and a whole bunch of people were pulled into it about this exact topic this week. And that's like, how much of the preseason, of your prior numbers should you use as you get farther into the season? And honestly, like I'm still using my projections for week 5 still have preseason numbers baked in. And that's because you basically have to look at these teams to a degree as a continuance from year to year, especially, if you've got the same quarterback, head coach, things like that. Now, obviously, when the roster turns over, the coach leaves, something like that, you do have to take that into account. But generally, if you were good for the last few years, history says you're probably, have a pretty high floor for this year too. So I think that kind of helps set the baseline for this year's projections.
Yeah, and somewhat unexpected along that lines, just because something caught my attention there. When do you, like, when a team surprises or unexpectedly comes out of nowhere? I mean, when do you kind of factor that? An example of that is Kansas, right? They're playing a lot better than people expected. The way they have played. How soon do you adjust maybe the number for them?
Yeah, no, that's a great question and a great example. Kansas was who came to my mind as you were asking the question. Yeah, and it's hard, right? Because I want to rely on what I know to be. So my numbers, like I know on average I can trust them, but there are outliers, like you said with Kansas. So what I do in that instance, I don't necessarily adjust their rating because I want to trust my formula. I don't want to start going, here's an exception, here's an exception, here's an exception. I want to try to use the same formula across the board. But what I will do, if my numbers say, okay, fade Kansas this week or take Kansas this week, I'll filter out the preseason data and make a separate projection using only this year's data. And if that projection agrees with my average projection, then I know I'm on the right side there. So I kind of just make little projections off to the side that I don't make public for these exact instances where a team maybe underperforms or performs, especially early in the season.
And do you find maybe spread versus total? Is there a difference between how you do your numbers and maybe one you feel more confident in than the other? Or does it kind of just depend on the year?
I think it kind of depends on the year, but I mean, so far this year, my totals have far outperformed my sides. And I think that makes sense to a degree because more people just in general bet sides, not as many people bet totals. So those, to me, that's a much less efficient market. So I think there probably is more room for an edge there on totals. And I think totals, to me, you can use much more unadjusted, like opponent adjusted data to come up with a total. But when you're trying to come up with a spread, it has to be opponent adjusted or you're wasting your time. With college, NFL is different. to an extent, but with college, I mean, you have to have those opponent adjusted numbers to come up with the spread.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, that kind of leads into the next question, right? What are some of the bigger differences between NFL and college? And do you maybe trust one more than the other? And if so, why?
Yeah, so really, to me, that is the biggest difference. Is so my method for projecting totals is pretty similar from NFL to college, but projecting a spread definitely is different, because in the NFL, like, yes, you still need to opponent adjust just to make sure it's super sharp, but you could get by, especially if you're just starting out, like, you can get by just taking the raw data and you're still going to be in the ballpark. But with college, like, if I tried to apply the same formula to my college numbers that I do for my NFL numbers, I would have Alabama and like Western Kentucky like 8 points apart, and we all know that's not the case. So to me, that is the biggest difference. It's just the disparity between the top of college football and the bottom. When you talk about Power 5 versus G5, and the NFL is kind of built around parity. The worst team gets the highest draft pick, and it's supposed to be like that. So to me, that is the biggest difference. What
do you think is maybe the biggest evolution from maybe 2019, what you learned, I guess, from maybe when you started this process in 2019 to now? I mean, I obviously you don't think your process was maybe perfect in the beginning. What do you think was the kind of biggest adjustment for you that you learned?
Yeah, I think getting into more efficiency metrics and paying less attention to, like total defense or points per game, allowed or scored. I think getting into more of those efficiency metrics has definitely been a focus and has really helped sharpen my numbers up over the last few years, for sure.
Yeah. And, obviously this is supposed to sound, complicated to someone who maybe doesn't know a whole lot right from the beginning. But I mean, this is something you can do through an Excel sheet. Where did you go maybe to start your process? I mean, when you first started making, numbers and stuff like that, what did you try to look up to like learn a little bit more about this information and kind of plug some of those numbers in?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I have no background in like data science or statistics or anything. I literally didn't even take a math class in college. I do have a bachelor's and a master's degree. I have a master's in business administration. So like took a little bit of like that sort of thing, but I have no background in this sort of thing. So I had to pretty much self-teach, and YouTube really is a great resource. Just getting on YouTube and watching people do opponent adjustments, or just basic how to calculate a spread, how to calculate a total, and just kind of taking bits and pieces from different people and kind of making it your own, I think is the best advice I could give on that.
Yeah. Any last minute advice on this kind of topic in general? I know I kind of threw a lot at you. Was there something that we didn't necessarily cover that you felt like you needed to throw out there?
No, I think we covered it. I think the biggest takeaway to summarize, that segment would just be efficiency. I think is king, because teams play at such different tempos, particularly in college. Being able to tempo adjust and look at those efficiency metrics versus the total points, total yards, that sort of thing. I think that is huge when you're trying to power rate in college.
That's awesome. Let's turn this into actionable info to close this thing out a couple minutes here. Just previewing the slate coming up. Week 4 in the NFL, we'll start there. It looks pretty compelling, right? There's 12, 13 games that are spread with 4 points or below. I mean, this is, if you're playing a Survivor League, if you're not kicked out already, it's a tough week to come up with Survivor, other than maybe the Packers. But what looking at this slate, is there anything that jumps out to you numbers wise that you're looking at this week?
So I haven't put in any NFL bets yet for this week, but I do have the Falcons plus 1.5 highlighted, and I think that line has moved already and is on the move. So I won't be surprised if that closes with the Falcons as a favorite against the Browns this week.
Nice. And then you're a Bengals fan, right? Is that correct?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on Thursday Night Football? I know a lot of people are making out to be about the Miami Dolphins having a short week and all the snaps they played and Sunday. I know your analysis isn't really focused on that part. It's more the numbers, but what do you think about the game on Thursday Night Football?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think from a situational standpoint, I think the Bengals are in a pretty good spot, capitalizing on the Dolphins' short week and that sort of thing. But the number, like I project it just over 4, and the line's at 4. So I mean, there's really not a lot of value in terms of the number. If I was gonna bet that game, I would lean to the under, because again, that's 2 where you can look at the situation with the Dolphins and say, okay, they're probably coming into this tired. So I think I would lean under. I project the total at 43.5. The line was at 47 the last time I checked. So some good number value there, and I like the situational spot.
That reminds me. I mean, how much do you kind of focus on that kind of stuff, that situational stuff that maybe not your numbers can't equate for, right, or account for? Is how much does that go into your handicapping process?
Yeah. So in terms of making the projection, it doesn't. But in terms of when I'm handicapping a game and trying to pick out some winners, that absolutely has to come into play. I think you have to take those things into consideration. But again, you can't really quantify them, so it doesn't go into my projection. So when I put my projections out every week on Twitter, that type of thing is not baked into it. But then when I'm picking my games, that absolutely goes into the handicap.
And as far as the college football slate, anything that jumps out kind of initially? I know you're someone who tweets out every single bet, right? That when you place a bet, you tweet it out. Is there anything that notable of the numbers that maybe still be available that you kind of like?
Yeah. So I just tweeted out a bunch of bets here like 30 minutes before we started the show. So I'll give out a couple here, and then if you want the rest of my card, you can certainly follow me at Buckeye Tie 23. But I like Minnesota -12 this week against Purdue. Not sure if Purdue's quarterback is going to play, so I went ahead and bought Minnesota at this number, because if O'Connell doesn't play, I expect that number to go north of 14, and if he does play, I can still live with the 12. So I like Minnesota -12 against Purdue, and then I also like Kansas Iowa State over 58. Those are 2 that really jump out, and then I think I've got 7 or 8 more bets that I just tweeted out. So if you follow me at Buckeye Tie 23, you can get all those, and those numbers should still be somewhat available.
Yeah, and where can everybody find your work? I mean, you're in a lot of different podcast segments. You're writing articles. I mean, where can everybody find everything that you kind of put out? Yeah,
so everything that I'm doing is going to get filtered into Twitter at some point. So that's the best place to follow me, is at Buckeye Tie 23. You can also read me on Fridays. Cleveland.com/OSU, where I put out an article every Friday, kind of giving an Ohio State perspective, because it's the Ohio State beat that I work for, as well as my 3 best bets of the week. And I also give out an upset alert pick of the week for an underdog that's a touchdown or more. So try to just take a long shot bet every week. So definitely find me there. And on the Friday episode of the Buckeye Talk podcast, is our gambling episode. So we talk all things betting there as well.
He is Tyler Shoemaker. I do recommend following him on Twitter at Buckeye Tie 23, one of the more underrated accounts you can follow during the football season, because you can get all this really good information that he just kind of jam-packed here in this 17, 20-minute show that we just did. So thank you so much for jumping on here, the Best Chicago Sports Podcast, Tyler. He is Tyler Shoemaker. I'm Shane Jackson. Thank you again, and see you on Friday.